3 minutes ago, the unthinkable happened. So Britain's highest court just forced Prime Minister Keir Starmer out of office. Not resigned. Not stepped down, forced out. The courtroom fell silent as the ruling was read, and in that moment, the political order of the United Kingdom shattered. The judgment that few believed possible has just rewritten modern British history, and behind the dignified silence of the Supreme Court, whispers of a royal hand are already spreading like wildfire, because this wasn't just a legal defeat. This was an execution, wrapped in protocol, delivered with a velvet glove. For weeks, tension had been building in Westminster like a ticking bomb. Starmer's conflict with the monarchy had pushed the nation to the brink. And the institutions of power, the palace, the courts, even Parliament, were no longer pretending to be neutral. But no one expected it to end like this. A Prime Minister removed not by Parliament, not by his own party, but by the very guardians of the Constitution. According to insiders, the Supreme Court's decision was unanimous, an extraordinary move justified by constitutional integrity and national stability. But behind those carefully chosen words lies a storm that could tear Britain apart. The courtroom witnesses described the atmosphere as electric, almost unreal. As the Chief Justice began reading the decision, Starmer's face went pale, his trademark composure evaporating before the cameras. The ruling stated that the Prime Minister had knowingly and repeatedly undermined the monarchy's constitutional role, a phrase that will be studied by historians for decades. Legal experts are calling it the most severe judicial intervention in British political history. One reporter inside the chamber said you could hear gasps when the verdict was delivered, and yet amid the chaos, one detail stood out. The presence of a senior royal legal advisor, seated quietly in the back row, observing everything, taking notes, saying nothing. Coincidence or coordination? Within minutes, Downing Street went into lockdown. Cabinet ministers were seen rushing in and out, phones glued to their ears, faces drawn and pale. Sources say Starmer refused to sign the formal notice of dismissal, claiming the court had no authority over an elected government. But according to constitutional law, once the court's ruling is certified by the Crown, his defiance means nothing. And that certification, insiders claim, was already being prepared inside Buckingham Palace even before the decision was read aloud. Think about that. The papers were ready before the verdict, almost as if someone knew what the outcome would be. By the time the news hit the airwaves, Britain was in turmoil. Crowds flooded Westminster, half cheering, half shouting in disbelief. Outside the Supreme Court, royalists waved flags and sang "God Save the King," while Starmer supporters chanted "Democracy betrayed." Police were forced to set up barricades as tensions spiralled. Social media exploded. Hashtags like Starmer out and royal coup trended within minutes, with millions of posts pouring in from across the world. Was this justice? Or was it a quiet royal revenge, finally brought to life through the courts? Inside the palace, no official statement has been released, not yet. But palace insiders, speaking under strict anonymity, claim the king has been kept fully informed of the court's decision and supports the restoration of constitutional balance. Those words, restoration of balance, are being interpreted as a silent royal approval. Reporters stationed outside Buckingham Palace describe an unusual sight. Black cars arriving one after another, carrying senior advisors, Privy Council members, and what appear to be legal envoys. Something is happening behind those golden gates. Something the public isn't supposed to see. And if the whispers are true, the monarchy isn't done yet. Across the country, shock is giving way to fury. Labour Party headquarters are in chaos, phones ringing off the hook, staffers in tears. Senior ministers are said to be considering resignations en masse, fearing they could be next in line for scrutiny. One MP described the atmosphere as a funeral without a body. Others are calling it a coup in slow motion, but whether it's a coup or a correction depends entirely on who you ask and who you trust. The King's silence once again has become the loudest sound in the nation. And now the question that everyone in Britain is asking is, and no one dares to answer, and is this: was this truly the rule of law or the return of the Crown's unseen power? The fallout from the Supreme Court's ruling has unleashed a storm unlike anything Britain has seen in modern history. Within hours, Downing Street turned into a fortress. Security barriers went up, journalists swarmed the gates, and helicopters circled overhead as police scrambled to control the swelling crowds. Keir Starmer, once the commanding voice of British politics, now finds himself cornered, politically exiled in his own residence. His aides are said to be packing boxes while lawyers frantically search for any legal loophole that could delay his formal removal. But every door seems to be closing faster than the last. The court's declaration was final. Effective immediately, it read, "Those two words have sent shockwaves through every corridor of power from Westminster to Windsor." Inside Parliament, the atmosphere borders on hysteria. Opposition MPs erupted into applause when the ruling was announced, while Labour loyalists sat in stunned silence, many unable to believe what had just happened. The Speaker of the House was forced to suspend the session as shouting matches broke out across the chamber. One Conservative MP reportedly shouted, "The Crown has spoken!" a phrase that instantly went viral across social media. Outside, reporters jostled for statements, but no one had clear answers. Britain's system, for all its traditions, had never prepared for a moment like this. A Prime Minister legally stripped of authority, yet refusing to leave. What happens next? No one seems to know. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace maintains its disciplined silence. The King has not spoken publicly, but subtle signals have begun to emerge. A royal standard was briefly raised over Windsor Castle, a symbolic gesture that historically indicates the monarch is in residence and engaged in state matters. Courtiers were seen moving between offices late into the night, and a small motorcade was spotted entering a side gate used exclusively for high-level meetings. Insiders whisper that an emergency Privy Council session has been convened, the first of its kind in decades, to discuss the constitutional vacuum created by the Prime Minister's disqualification. If true, it means the monarchy is already preparing for a transition of power. And yet the silence from the palace is calculated, deliberate, the kind of quiet that precedes a decisive strike. Public opinion has fractured down the middle. To some, this is justice at last. The restoration of respect toward the Crown and the Constitution. To others, it's a nightmare. Proof that democracy in Britain can be undone by invisible hands wearing velvet gloves. Outside the Supreme Court, protesters clash in the rain, their chants echoing through Parliament Square. Signs read, "Rule of law and no King's Court." The irony doesn't escape anyone. Commentators describe the scene as a nation divided not just by politics, but by identity. The old Britain of duty and order versus the new Britain of reform and rebellion. And at the centre of it all stands Keir Starmer, the man who dared to challenge the Crown and found himself crushed beneath it. Rumours now swirl that the King's private secretary has reached out to senior opposition leaders to ensure continuity of government. Translation: preparations for a caretaker Prime Minister might already be underway. Names are being whispered: Angela Rayner, David Lammy, even Rishi Sunak, as possible interim figures to stabilise the government until a new election can be called. Yet behind every rumour lies another question. Who is truly making these decisions? The courts, the Crown, or someone else entirely? Reports from political correspondents suggest that certain royal advisers had quietly consulted with constitutional scholars weeks before the verdict. A timeline that raises eyebrows about just how unexpected today's outcome really was. Across the Atlantic, the international reaction has been explosive. American news outlets call it Britain's constitutional earthquake. European leaders issue carefully worded statements urging calm, while markets tumble in real time. The pound drops sharply and investors demand clarity on who exactly runs Britain now. Meanwhile, Commonwealth nations watch closely, some expressing concern that the crisis could spark Republican movements in their own countries. But back home, the mood is shifting from disbelief to defiance. Labour supporters have taken to the streets in record numbers, calling the court's move an act of royal overreach. In Manchester, thousands gathered outside the local council building, chanting, "Bring back our vote." The government may have fallen, but the fire has only just begun. As night descends over London, the city glows under an eerie tension. The kind that comes when a country realises it's standing on the edge of something historic and possibly irreversible. Reporters speak in hushed tones, the public waits for answers, and Buckingham Palace remains shrouded in mystery. But one thing is certain, the silence won't last forever. Because sooner or later, someone will have to step forward and fill the vacuum left behind by Keir Starmer's downfall. And when that moment comes, the real question won't be who takes his place, but who gave the order that brought him down in the first place. And the shocking truth about that order may be the one thing Britain was never meant to know. By dawn, Britain was a country unrecognisable. The streets of Westminster, once symbols of stability and tradition, had turned into a living battlefield of words, banners and disbelief. News and Call struggled to keep up with the avalanche of updates. Mass resignations from Labour's upper ranks, emergency sessions in Parliament and unconfirmed reports that the King had privately met with senior justices overnight. Nothing was official, yet everything was changing by the hour. The headlines spoke for themselves. Government in collapse, monarchy steps in, and Starmer defies the crown. Each headline fed the next, each rumour pouring gasoline on a fire that was already consuming the political heart of the nation. Inside Downing Street, the air was thick with panic and betrayal. Starmer's closest advisers, once fiercely loyal, began to distance themselves. Some fled the building before reporters could reach them, while others quietly began deleting communications and personal notes. One senior official, speaking anonymously, described the atmosphere as the end of an empire. Starmer himself, defiant but visibly shaken, was said to be pacing in his office, making frantic calls to party veterans, seeking allies who no longer wanted to answer. For years, he had built his image as the unflappable moderniser of Labour, the man who could outthink both the right and the crown. But now his greatest weapon, his composure, was gone, and all that remained was a leader surrounded by silence. In a dramatic twist, the Attorney General's office issued a late-night clarification stating that the Supreme Court's ruling carries constitutional weight equivalent to an Act of Parliament. The phrase sent shockwaves through the political world. Translation: Starmer's refusal to comply was no longer defiance, or it was illegality. The police were reportedly briefed on protocols for enforcement, though no one dared imagine what that meant in practice. Arresting a sitting Prime Minister? It sounded unthinkable, until today when the unthinkable had already become routine. Sources whispered that a legal notice had been prepared for Starmer's immediate removal. Should he continue to resist, the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, outside, London pulsed with chaos. Thousands gathered near Buckingham Palace, half demanding answers, half declaring allegiance. A strange sense of theatre filled the air, as if the entire country had become a stage, and the monarchy had quietly taken back its starring role. Protesters waved signs reading, "Power to the people," while others chanted, "Long live the King." It was no longer just a political crisis, but it was a cultural reckoning. Old loyalties buried deep in British identity were resurfacing. Even the BSO, once neutral to the point of monotony, began using words like historic, unprecedented, and constitutional rupture. Every camera lens pointed toward the palace gates, waiting for the moment the royal silence would finally break. And then, just after 10 a.m, something extraordinary happened. The palace released a written statement, a brief, elegant and utterly devastating. His Majesty acknowledges the judgment of the Supreme Court and reaffirms his commitment to constitutional continuity. That was all. 21 words that detonated like a bomb across the nation. To the public, it sounded neutral. To those who understood the language of power, it was a declaration. The King had accepted the court's verdict. He had recognised Starmer's removal as legitimate, and by doing so, he had drawn a line through modern British politics, one that could never be erased. The reaction was immediate. Cheers erupted outside the palace. Social media lit up with hashtags like #TheKingDecides and #EndOfStarmer. Within hours, global leaders issued statements acknowledging the constitutional transition. Diplomatic language for the fall of a government. Markets began to stabilise as if the world had collectively decided that the Crown's calm was safer than Starmer's chaos. Yet behind the scenes, Britain's power brokers were scrambling. The Privy Council was summoned for an emergency meeting. Several members of Parliament received calls inviting them to Windsor for consultations. Constitutional advisers drafted what insiders now call the Windsor Papers, a set of protocols outlining how the monarchy could legally guide the formation of a caretaker government. But not everyone was celebrating. In the north, massive protests erupted. Cities like Manchester, Leeds and Liverpool became flashpoints of outrage. For them, this wasn't justice, it was betrayal. "We didn't vote for a king's court," one protester shouted into a live broadcast. In response, royalists accused them of disrespecting the crown. The divide was no longer political, it was moral, cultural, ecological, even generational. Britain, once bound by its quiet traditions, was now tearing itself apart over the meaning of those very traditions. And amid all the noise, one question kept echoing through the halls of power and the streets of London alike. If the king could bring down a prime minister with silence and the courts by his side, what could stop him from reshaping Britain itself? The answer might lie in what happened next. And the world wasn't ready to see it. The hours that followed became the most surreal in British political history. As dusk fell over London, a grim silence replaced the earlier chaos. Downing Street, once buzzing with defiance, stood eerily quiet. Armed officers took position near the gates, and a sealed letter was delivered by a royal courier, bearing the insignia of Buckingham Palace. Its contents were never officially disclosed, but within 30 minutes, Keir Starmer appeared before the cameras, pale and expressionless. "I will respect the rule of law," he said in a strained voice before turning his back to the flashing lights. That single sentence marked the end of his premiership. Just like that, Britain's most powerful man had been undone, not by a vote, not by scandal, but by the Crown and the courts acting in silent harmony. The nation collectively held its breath. The era of Keir Starmer was over. But the end of one man's rule only deepened the mystery of who was truly in charge. Within hours, government officials began receiving temporary appointment orders, signed not by the Prime Minister's office, but by the Privy Council itself. A structure from centuries past had been resurrected, and no one could quite explain why. Civil servants found themselves reporting to royal liaisons, and cabinet meetings were suspended until further instruction. The monarchy, it seemed, was not merely filling a void, it was reclaiming authority. And for the first time in living memory, Britain felt like a kingdom again, not a democracy. What the public didn't know was that this had all been in motion long before the verdict. Whispers from insiders suggest that months ago, quiet discussions began inside Windsor's inner circle, fueled by concerns that Starmer's policies had pushed too far against the constitutional boundaries of the Crown. Some say the tipping point came when Starmer proposed legislation limiting royal influence in judicial appointments. Others point to a classified intelligence report claiming foreign interference within Starmer's digital campaign fund. Whatever the cause, the palace had been preparing, waiting for the perfect moment to act with clean legality and perfect precision. And when the Supreme Court finally ruled, the monarchy didn't have to lift a finger. It simply let the law speak in its favour. Internationally, the shockwaves haven't stopped. Washington and Brussels are demanding clarification on who leads the UK government, while Commonwealth leaders nervously assess whether this royal resurgence could reignite independence movements across their nations. Yet inside Britain, something even more astonishing is happening. The public, though divided, is slowly adapting to this new reality. Opinion polls show a spike in approval for the King's stabilising role. Media outlets that once championed Starmer's progressive vision are now cautiously aligning themselves with the monarchy's quiet authority. The narrative is shifting, chaos under the politicians, order under the Crown. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it's there. A rewriting of modern Britain's story right before the world's eyes. Behind closed doors, former allies of Starmer are trying to regroup. Reports claim secret meetings are taking place in private homes away from surveillance and press intrusion. Their mission? To challenge the court's ruling through European channels, arguing that it breaches democratic sovereignty. But time is not on their side. Parliament has been temporarily dissolved, pending reorganisation, a bureaucratic phrase masking a constitutional earthquake. Legal experts warn that every passing day makes it harder to restore the previous system. Britain may already have crossed a point of no return, and if the Crown truly has regained control, then democracy may never return in the same form again. And yet, amid this grand power shift, there's an even darker layer unfolding beneath the surface. Classified intelligence leaks hint that a covert advisory group, codenamed Project Regency, was behind the coordination between royal legal teams and senior judges. If real, it means the verdict wasn't just a legal consequence, it was a calculated operation. Names have begun to surface: billionaire donors, media magnates, and former intelligence chiefs, all allegedly tied to the plan to restore constitutional order. The evidence is circumstantial but chillingly coherent. A network that had waited decades for its chance may have finally succeeded, cloaked in the legitimacy of law and tradition. As midnight strikes, Britain feels suspended between two realities: the democratic illusion it once knew and the royal order it has returned to. The lights in Buckingham Palace remain on long after the city sleeps. Somewhere behind those gilded walls, decisions are being made. Decisions that will determine not just the country's next leader, but its very identity. And while the media speculates while the world watches, one truth grows impossible to ignore: power has shifted silently but completely. Because if a single court ruling can erase a prime minister and resurrect royal power overnight, then perhaps Britain never truly stopped being a monarchy. But here's the question haunting everyone from Parliament to the palace: if the Crown can force out one leader, who will dare to challenge it next?